This is the second of 4 videos that I've been making about 4 subjects that I think science fiction and fantasy authors should dive into as a way to enrich their work. And they cover money, society, thought, and power. Today's video, I'm talking about thought, specifically philosophy. Now, the minute I said that word, I bet a bunch of you flinched and thought, oh God, philosophy, that's going to break my brain. Well, I'm here to tell you it's not going to be anywhere nearly as intimidating as you might think. Because at core, philosophy is about a very simple idea. It is about the search for the truth, and it is about all the ways that search manifests in our lives. We all have ideas, and many of those ideas we take for granted as givens. They just seem to be part of the air we breathe. But where did they come from? How did those ideas develop, and why did we keep some of them over time and throw others away? And the history of those changes is the history of philosophy. It's the history of the schools of philosophy, all of its major figures, the influences that they have had on the world we live in. And you don't need to study every nook and cranny of philosophy to understand how this works. You don't need to drill into every single philosophy that's ever been thunk up. You can study the general history of it. You can see how things flowed over the centuries from one school of thought to another. And then, if you're so inclined, you can drill down into specific philosophies or specific philosophers. You can learn about which ideas keep resurfacing, how we talk about them, and what may come after our current modes of thought. Now, I'm curious about philosophy, both as a general intellectual thing and also because I'm fascinated with the ways that people make mental models of the world and then live inside them. And that's what characters in stories do. Every character in a story is the embodiment of some point of view, especially in a science fiction or fantasy story where you have big ideas of one kind or another tending to predominate. So some sense of how we think about ideas can be useful to get a grip on that. Why would you have 2 people in a story who, despite sharing so much, are completely unable to agree on something? It's because they don't share a worldview. They don't share a philosophy. I mentioned before, I think, that philosophy is not always something we know that we have. We're philosophers whether or not we're aware of it. So becoming more conscious of the ways we think about our world lets us see our own thinking that much more clearly. And this shines through in things like discussions about morality. Is there such a thing as a truly right and wrong action? Now, I don't think there is personally. I think things like that are contextual. But I do think that understanding the context for such things as completely as we can is important and helps us tease right and wrong apart that much more clearly. And that context is going to be made up out of our place in history, the society we live in, and all of the previous arguments the world has had about good and bad, the history of these ideas, the history of philosophy. And becoming conscious of those things helps us think about them more clearly. Now, various individual philosophies can be convoluted, but you're not obliged to understand any single one of them in complete depth to get an idea of the ways that they differ. And not all philosophies or philosophers are going to work the same way either. Some of you have probably heard of Nietzsche, for instance. He wasn't a very rigorous philosopher. He was very much a polemicist. He was someone who had ideas and wanted to strenuously defend them with rhetoric. He wanted to talk about ideas that affected us all, how they could be questioned. And so that makes him a very specific kind of philosopher. He's not interchangeable with a lot of other kinds of philosophers, but that's the point. They're not all stamped from the same mold. And I talked before about philosophy as history, the history of ideas overtaking and replacing each other, and how those things inform real-world actions, and vice versa. One part of that I think that's really important is how philosophy has over time differentiated itself from religious practice and religious belief. This is something that you could see as far back as the pre-Socratic philosophers from ancient Greece, and then something that surfaces again later after the rise of Christianity. Asking the big questions outside of a specific framework of belief can be difficult, not because of the ideas, but because of the sociology, because of the dominance of religion as a social force constraining the way dissent and thought can work. And over time, as religious institutions have ceded power to secular institutions, it's gotten easier to do that. But there's always been this tension between religious institutions and philosophical development. It's a constant force in the history of philosophy. And another thing that is, I think, also important is when we talk about philosophy as praxis, about how it is that we debate ideas, how we have logical rigor about things. And logic, which goes hand in hand with any talk of philosophy, it's a tool for philosophical work. In the words of Stephen Downes, a guy who wrote a wonderful guide to logical fallacies, I've linked to it in the description, logic is a truth-preserving tool, but not necessarily a truth-generating tool. And the reasons that we believe things are not always themselves logical. But to the degree we can use logic to debate with others in good faith, we should do that. And the best use of logic is not to try and tame other people's thinking. It's to tame our own. It's to perform a certain amount of self-reflection and try to figure out where we might be making mistakes with our ideas. It's also far easier and more constructive, I think, to critique our own ideas than to critique others willy-nilly. Very few people take kindly to being told, oh, you've just committed the fallacy of the false analogy. And the arena for ideas is also sociological, as I noted earlier with religion. It's not a purely intellectual thing. Bad ideas, unproductive ideas, harmful ideas never completely go away even when they're debunked. Because not everybody's going to be a perfectly rational actor, and politics is a thing. But that doesn't mean the pursuit of philosophy is a meaningless thing. It just means that we don't have much choice but to practice it in the real world, in our present moment, in the matrix of our society and all of its convolution and politicking. And being aware of how to do that also helps. So why study these things for the sake of science fiction and fantasy stories? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that you want to figure out what schools of thought exist in the world you're building, what they are all about, how they compete with each other, how they inform the world around them and shape it and change it, and vice versa. In other words, what the history of ideas is like in your world, and maybe also what kinds of ideas people in your world are holding without even being conscious of them. And another possibility is to find ideas that can be source material for your stories. The various philosophies, the various philosophers, and their backstories can be inspiration itself. It can be raw material. Back when I talked about the book, Why Does the World Exist?, one of the things that I singled out was the contrasts between the different worldviews that all of the people in it had with regard to these big normative ideas that they were discussing, how those things got embodied in specific people with specific lives. And fiction thrives on the specific. So if you are able to put these ideas into the lives and the mouths of highly specific people with highly specific agendas, that's much more interesting than just describing the philosophies in question nakedly on the page. Another thing that comes to mind is to see how these ideas clash with each other and to use those conflicts as material. What was the context that various people had for believing things, and what contexts exist in your story that can give rise to specific thinkers or ideas? How can your story be driven by the way things collide with each other, the way people disagree, big or small? And finally, one more thing you can do, you can use it to enrich your world's background at arm's length. In other words, you can use it in a way that doesn't necessarily play a direct role in your story, but can add color. It can be something that eventually makes its way into your world building. It can become a bigger thing in time, but if you just want to use it as something to make the story more interesting in its more general details, that's great too. So how would you go about learning about philosophy at the level that I've described? Well, in the first video that I made in this series, my first recommendation, which was when I was talking about economics, was to pick up a textbook. And I'm going to say the same thing here. And in fact, I'm going to recommend a textbook from the same publisher, an outfit named OpenStax. And they have an introduction to philosophy. Again, I will link below. And I'm a little iffy on the way some of the ideas in it are introduced, especially in the first module. So it takes a little bit of reading to get settled into it. But its single biggest advantage is that it is free. The whole thing is available online, either in HTML or as a downloadable PDF, and you can buy print copies as well. So it serves as a good jumping off point. You have a nice general overview of a lot of the basic conceits in philosophy, and the debates therein, and you can use those as a springboard. A book that I want to recommend as another general overview, but is much more readable, it's less dry, it's much more enjoyable, is a book called The History of Philosophy by A.C. Grayling, and it's a soup to nuts overview, mainly of Western philosophy, although they do touch on some other schools of thought. And again, it also works as a great jumping off point. It's fun to read. And while there's only a couple of pages of treatment of each philosophy or philosopher, that's often enough to get you started and to give you a taste for what else you could find out about them. Another one that I've had recommended to me, and I haven't read this one, so take that with a grain of salt, is Norton's Introduction to Philosophy, the second edition. And a big part of why this was recommended is because it covers a lot of relatively up to the second ideas, like the ethics of AI or animal rights. One more book I want to recommend that I have read and which I've enjoyed tremendously is called Confessions of a Philosopher, A Personal Journey Through Western Philosophy from Plato to Popper, by a gentleman named Brian McGee. McGee is a British philosopher who's written a great number of books that are great explainers for various philosophers in their schools, one of them being Karl Popper, who is mentioned in that title and who is a favorite of mine as well. What I like about this book is that it is a first-person narrative. It's him talking about his life story as expressed through his love of philosophy and his journey through it. It's a great example of a thinker as a character. And at some point I will talk about Karl Popper separately because his work has also been a big influence on me, but that's worthy of a video all unto itself. So again, the study of philosophy is, I think, a big boon to anyone who's writing science fiction or fantasy. And it's not even something you have to go all that deeply into to get an idea of how things work. Any of the surface level surveys that I've talked about are a great place to get started. And again, if you're spurred to dig deeper, absolutely do so and see what you think.